Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you everyone for joining and welcome to today's Norms and Behavioral Change Talk. My name is Angela Jiang Wang, and for those who don't know me, I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics at the University of Pennsylvania. Just for you to know, this seminar will be recorded and we will upload the video to our YouTube channel and website as always. Moving to today's agenda, we have two very interesting talks for you today. We will start with a brief talk by an early career researcher, Laura Honig, and followed by the main talk by Ernesto Reuben. After these talks, we will have a Q&A segment open to all participants towards the end of today's session. For anyone who might be new to this series, the NoBec talks are organized by the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics here at Penn, with the support of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program, and in partnership with the Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences program. The center itself is a research center which provides specialized consulting, research, and training services to organizations throughout the world seeking to enact positive behavioral change. Here you can see the schedule of our upcoming NoBec talks. This will be the last talk of the current academic year, then we will take a break on the summer and we will kickstart all talks again in September by Catherine Molo. You can register for these talks on our website or scan the QR code right here. We publish usually the titles and abstracts about 1 week before each talk on our website and in our newsletter. So you can also sign up in the newsletter to receive updates about future talks. So lastly, before we turn to our speakers, please just note a few ground rules. You should be automatically muted when entering the meeting, but if you are not, please mute yourself. And if possible, please keep your camera on so we can have a more interactive discussion. For questions, you can use the chat at any time, or you can use the raise hand function at the end of the Q&A segment. And as I said before, the recordings of the sessions will be uploaded to our website and YouTube channel. Our first presentation today is by an early career researcher, Laura Honig. Laura is a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Experimental and Applied Psychology at the, forgive me for my pronunciation, Right Universiteit Amsterdam. Laura studies social decision-making in contexts of cooperation, conflict, and corruption, and is interested in the roles of inequality and ideology. Her experience spans across cross-cultural, experimental, survey, neurophysiological, and statistical methods, aiming to connect micro-level processes to macro-level policy implications. Laura received a PhD cum laude in social, economic, and organizational psychology from Leiden University in November 2024. And Laura's presentation today is on the social cost of corruption, how institutions shape cooperation across 34 societies. Before we move to the talk, I just want to remind you that if you have any questions coming up during the presentation, you can feel free to write them in the chat. And now I stop sharing my screen so you can present Laura. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for the invite and for the kind introduction, Angela. Let me see if I managed to repeat what we did before, which is to properly share my screen and the presentation. Let me redo this. Right. Now you should be able to see the presentation mode, I hope. Great. Okay. So my name is Laura Honig and I'm a postdoc at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam. So Angela was very close with the pronunciation. So good evening from Amsterdam. I will present some data that I collected together with Angela Romano and Giuliano Spadaro on how institutions, and in particular corrupt institutions, shape cooperation across 34 different societies. And here are my collaborators, including Giuliano Spadaro, who also obtained the grant to complete this endeavor. As many of us in this call may know, I think there are a lot of countries where people experience institutional representatives that abuse public means for their private gain. And as you can see on this map that shows the Control of Corruption Index from Transparency International, this phenomenon may vary a lot across countries, but it is present in virtually all over the world. And so this abuse of public means for private gain is a textbook definition of institutional corruption. And institutional corruption can erode trust, it decreases economic growth, and it exacerbates inequalities or even creates inequalities. And this is why a large body of research has looked at these kind of consequences that institutional corruption has for societies and spend their focus on this. What we do with this project is we took a step back and looked at what is the function of institutions to begin with. So institutions can set the rules of the games. They can determine the incentives to deter free riding or not. And they can provide a feeling of security in situations and interactions that are otherwise uncertain. For instance, interactions with strangers. And so I come to our main research question that we asked at the beginning of this project. Do cues of corruption of institutional representatives undermine cooperation, for instance, with strangers? And you see here on the slide that I'm talking about third parties. This is the standard operationalization of institutional representatives. So I will refer to them as third parties throughout this presentation. And so there is some evidence from previous work that would make us think that cues of corruption may indeed undermine cooperation. That stems from large-scale surveys. There's some work that showed that individuals that moved from more corrupt countries to less corrupt countries experienced a change in societal trust. And lastly, there's also some behavioral evidence from within the US from my collaborator, Juliana. If we now imagine, these people from all these different countries that you see on this map coming into an experiment where they are confronted with a potentially corrupt third party, I think it's reasonable to believe that not all of these people are going to interpret the situation in the same way. I mean, we are psychologists after all, some of us. So we found it very important to think about this country-level exposure to corruption as a potential moderator. And we had two competing hypotheses about this in our mind. On the one hand, individuals may habituate to these weak institutions, potentially corrupt institutions, and become less sensitive to a corrupt institution, and potentially information becomes less salient to them. On the other hand, individuals in more corrupt societies have made very personal negative experience with the consequences of corruption. So they may also react more strongly to those cues of corruption and thereby base their behavior more strongly on those cues. And to answer these questions, we collected data in 34 societies across the world that vary in the natural occurrence of institutional corruption. We collected roughly 13,500 participants with a panel agency. And here I give you a brief overview of the paradigm that consisted of three parts. In the interest of time, I'm just going to explain them really briefly, but I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions later on. So in the first part, we collected real information about the level of corruption or honesty of a third party. And we did that by using a die rolling task. And this information of the third parties was then presented to the participants in our main experiment, in our cross-cultural experiment, where participants completed multiple one-shot decisions in the prisoner's dilemma. So they were always paired with different other participants, and they made the decisions whether or not to cooperate in a prisoner's dilemma, and also to which degree to cooperate. And sometimes they made this decision in the absence of a third-party punisher that could deduct from their earnings, or in the presence of an anonymous third-party punisher, a corrupt or an honest third-party punisher. And of course, we didn't use these labels, but we presented them differently. And we also asked participants to indicate their expectations of punishment and expected cooperation of their interaction partner. And lastly, all of these decisions were matched. So in this part one, we had also collected all of the potential punishment decisions of our third-party punishers, so that we were able to lastly match all of these decisions together so that the study involved no deception and all decisions could be incentivized. Right, so I'm moving to a first sort of manipulation check where we asked participants to what extent they perceived the third-party punisher that they were presented with as potentially honest in reporting their score from this die rolling task. And here you see the means across the 34 countries. And indeed, we see that individuals across all of these 34 societies perceived the corrupt third-party punisher in red as less honest than the honest third-party punisher in green. And we see very little variation in this evaluation for the honest third-party punisher, but we do see some variation for the red dots, so for the evaluation of the corrupt third party. And of course, we wondered what may be able to explain this variation. And we thought of the societal level, country level, levels of corruption. And again, here we see the corruption control index from Transparency International. And I just want to note that the higher this value, the higher the control, so the lower the corruption. So we see that people that live in countries that are less accustomed to corruption react more strongly to this cue of corruption and evaluate the third-party punisher as even less honest compared to people in more corrupt countries. And then turning to our main question, whether cues of corruption of third parties decrease cooperation across societies. And again, we see the means here, but I may actually skip forward to the forest plot to show you that indeed across these 34 countries, we see that participants decrease the level of cooperation in the prisoner's dilemma under a corrupt third-party punisher compared to an honest third-party punisher. However, we also again see that there's quite some variation across these 34 countries, and this, I'm referring back to my sort of competing hypothesis idea before. We thought that maybe the country level exposure to corruption may be able to moderate this relationship and explain some of this variance. And indeed, we see that participants in more corrupt countries with less corruption control, so on the left, do not base their decision how much to cooperate on the information about the third-party punisher. They cooperate to very, very similar degrees, whereas people in less corrupt countries with more control on the right significantly decrease their cooperation level under a corrupt third-party punisher. And this for us is kind of suggestive of this habituation perspective that I mentioned before, where people seem to pay less attention to this corruption cue or evaluate it differently. Right, we also had included an individual level measure of corruption. So what I presented you before was this country level corruption measure. We also included 3 items that I will skip over in the interest of time, but we included these items to measure perceived corruption of the own country, and we indeed replicate the finding of a country level measure. So you see here on the x-axis the perceived corruption of the own country, and people who perceive their country to be more corrupt, again, differentiate less between their corruption levels under an honest or a corrupt third-party punisher, whereas participants that perceive their country to be less corrupt significantly decrease their cooperation level under a corrupt third-party punisher. Right, and I'm already reaching the take-home message, what we find is that cues of corruption of third parties negatively affect cooperation across 34 societies. Participants from societies characterized by low corruption seem to react more negatively to these experienced episodes of corruption. And I did not have time to explain this in detail, but it seems to be that changes in expected cooperation are a likely mechanism underlying this relationship, but not expected punishment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laura. Fantastic presentation. If any of you have questions for Laura, feel free to leave them in the chat. I actually left already a question for you. And now we will have to move on to the main talk. So let me share my screen again. All right. Today's main talk will be by Ernesto Reuben. Ernesto Reuben is a Global Network Professor of Economics at NYU and Professor of Economics, Business, Organizations and Society and Program Head of Business, Organizations and Society at NYU Abu Dhabi. His research applies behavioral economics to public and labor economics, focusing on collective action problems, social norms, and the effects of gender differences in preferences and beliefs on hiring practices and career choices. Ernesto's talk today is on meritocracy around the globe. So Ernesto, I will stop sharing my screen now so you can start your presentation. Thank you again so much for joining us today.
Okay, thank you very much, Angela. And yes, thank you for the invitation. I've always followed this seminar, even though I usually cannot join because of the time. But it's an honor to be here, I think. And this is a paper that we've been working on for a while. It's a little bit outside of my normal work, so in that sense, I'm very open to ideas, suggestions, and so on. Just to say, I don't see the chat, so if you have questions or anything, please unmute and jump in at any time. So, like Angela was saying, this is work that we're doing around the idea of meritocracy. So let me explain a bit why we think that's what is there. Why we think this is an interesting thing to investigate. Meritocracy is it's something that we hear a lot, right? It's hard to define sometimes, but it's certainly something that we listen to. Like this is just to say public figures, politicians refer to this all the time as a desirable property, right? They say societies should be meritocratic. And this is something that we need to, it's a goal for a society to be meritocratic, and that this has a lot of positive things, right? So that the more meritocratic societies will be more productive. They will, yes, they will grow more, things like this. We hear this a lot, right? So the concept that meritocracy is desirable, it's certainly out there in the public discourse, right? Beyond that, I would say there's also some critics of this, right? There's people that if you look at the criticisms of the idea of meritocracy, what they're basically saying is that that meritocracy doesn't really exist in some ways, and but the label of meritocracy can actually be a way of hiding or justifying inequality, right? So because that's a little bit the counter argument is to say, if you have a meritocratic society, that will also be an unequal society, because there will be the highly productive or the people that put in a lot of effort and so on will be rewarded for that, and then that will create differences between individuals, right? So there's this link of meritocracy with inequality, and this idea that if we believe in meritocracy, then we believe that the rich deserve what they have, right? And this is a little bit the criticism of that. That is to say that societies might not actually be meritocratic, but it's used as a way of justifying these inequalities, right? So there's this counterpower point to the idea that meritocracy could always be a good thing, right? Uh, but a lot of this is just talk, right? It's people that they just think of it and they make these claims, but there's actually very, very little actual research or that tries to look at this, define it in some way, and then and then investigate whether these claims are true or not. So that's where we come in. We want to kind of like investigate this at at the global level, at the macro at the macro level, right? So um, overall, I would say so. The concept of meritocracy, like I was saying, is at the heart of political and economic culture. And it's not just politicians and academics that discuss this, right? There is lots of now experimental research, for example, showing that the idea that merit, however that's defined, should be rewarded is something that is
Ernesto, I think we lost you. Am I the only one who stopped hearing Ernesto?
I also stopped hearing and
Yeah.
seeing.
No,
Yes.
no,
It's him.
I stopped
It's not
hearing.
us, Reuben.
We might have lost him. Oh no. I still see his slides. Okay, I think did he just leave the call? Yes. Maybe his internet connection fell through. Let's hope he can rejoin. Emma, let us know if he writes to you, let you know updates of his situation. Meanwhile, while we wait for Ernesto, I'm sorry everyone about this happening, but maybe this is a good chance for people to ask some questions to Laura's presentation if you have any.
There he is.
I'm so sorry. I got disconnected for a moment.
Oh, perfect, Ernesto, perfect.
Yes, let's see. Now I switch to my phone. Uh, there we go.
Yes, we see your slides now.
Yeah, okay, good. Hopefully now it's gonna be stable. Yes. My apologies. So let me see. Let me get to the punchline. So basically, this is the motivation for a paper. We want to kind of like at least show some light or investigate some of these questions, right? So first of all is, can we, take a definition of meritocracy, operationalize it, come up with an actual measure, a quantitative measure that we can use to measure the extent to which countries are meritocratic. And then with that measure, then we can see, things like is actual meritocracy as measured, how I'll explain in a moment, associated with, for example, higher productivity or higher societal income, right? So this is a bit like, that's the positive side of meritocracy. And then what we also want to look at is this other side, is to say, well, is meritocracy related then also to income inequality and redistribution, right? So there's lots of evidence that says that people are in the lab settings, they want to redistribute less if income is earned through merit, right? And like I was saying, if you have meritocracy, then there's a like logical, hypothesis that would say that will also create inequality, right? So we want to kind of like investigate this by empirically across different countries to see how that plays out. Of course, there always comes the question of then, okay, but what is meritocracy, right? I mean, just to be clear, maybe this is a little disappointing for Christina or someone. This is not a paper where we go into what is meritocracy. We will take a definition of it based on a very, let's say, reading of how this is defined. So this is how, at least in Wikipedia, they would say meritocracy is the notion of a political system in which economic goods or political power are vested in individual people based on ability, talent, rather than wealth and social class, for instance, right? So we are taking this quite literally and saying, okay, let's define meritocracy this way. And of course, there's always going to be questions of like, is that really meritocracy? Can we really say that meritocracy? That we cannot answer here, but we can look at least this very rough notion of what meritocracy is. So let me just define a little bit exactly what we do, and to give you a sense of what we're measuring. Okay. We take the basic idea is to say, what is meritocracy? Well, that's when you reward people for performance. So high performance should be rewarded compared to something like luck or just having like social connections or something like this. So what we want is this measure of, we have a measure of performance, and we want to see whether that is correlated with a form of reward, right? So that it's a basic notion like that, right? Now, what do we do? What do we take as reward? Well, we're going to look at income. So we're going to be, like I said, we're going to have a measure of performance, and we're just going to say, is that measure of performance predicting income in a given country? So in that sense, it's easy to, it's a simple exercise to do to some extent, right? Why income and not other things? Well, big part of it is that income, it's pretty well. First, economists are very interested in that, and then it's something that's easy to measure compared to something like wealth, for instance, right? And also, there's theory that would say that income should reflect marginal productivity. So, in that sense, we want to see whether that's actually in some ways the case, right? So our reward part is just simply income. And what do we take as performance? And here's where it can get a little tricky. What we're actually doing is to say, well, we're going to basically run a test of fluid intelligence to assess performance. So it's how people perform in this particular test. Now, why do we take this test? There's various reasons. One is that fluid intelligence is been shown to be correlated with performance in many different types of tasks, right? So people with high fluid intelligence will be high performing, whether they're farming or whether they are working in an office or so on, right? So in that sense, is a good proxy for performance outside of the lab style environment, right? That's one. Then another one is that fluid intelligence. Well, it's a well-accepted measure, and the measure that we use is also one that it's comparable across cultures, right? Which is important when you're doing this thing across different parts of the world, right? So it's a measure that doesn't require particular language, or it's the same across languages. It doesn't need translation in that respect, and in fact, intelligence is a central concept in discussions about meritocracy, right? So a lot of people do think that high intelligence should be something that is rewarded, right? Of course, here's where it comes a little bit of philosophical issues to say, well, if you are intelligent, is that really your merit? That's a little harder to let's say, to think about. And like I said, in this paper, we don't really go into that. We just take this definition and we implement it this way. A lot of people ask me at this whether, why not something like effort, which is what is measured in I mean, a lot of people think of meritocracy more as, whether you put in effort or not. we would love to do that, but that's a lot harder to measure, right? To have a quick lab style measure of effort that we could claim translates into effort outside other areas, that is much more difficult to do. So this is what we do, and then yeah, maybe at the end we can discuss whether this is actually meritocracy or not. But that's the exercise that we're doing, right? So what are we doing? Well, we're basically measuring this in different countries, and we're constructing this meritocracy index, right? Which just is the simple association between income and fluid intelligence. So what we're saying is that a country is meritocratic when intelligence correlates with income, meaning that they are rewarded for their high productivity. And this is the idea. Let me see. So these are the type of questions that we can. Yeah, Angela, you have a question.
Yes, I'm asking a question now because you gave us permission to do this
Yes,
economic
yes.
style. But since you're studying correlation, could it also be reverse causality? So maybe someone with higher income has been exposed to better nutrition, better environment growing up, and maybe that raised their test score. So could it be the opposite here?
I mean that's a very good question. Yes, and this goes to the core. I mean, to me, of the definition to some extent, right? Is to say we have to think of like where does high intelligence come from? I mean, there's good, let's say, research that would say things like extreme poverty and things like that could be starting down your income, right? And then to me, that's more of a philosophical question to some extent, is to say, well, then is that really meritocracy? If you're smart because your parents are wealthy, and then you produce a lot because of that, does that mean that it's merit based or not, right? I don't know. But from the simple definition, that is just to say, if you're performing well, or you should be rewarded for that. If we keep it at that level, then they would say, then this measure matters, right? And in fact, but you'll see with some of our results, I think some of our results are a bit more in line with this idea. I don't know if I would call it reverse causality, but is this idea that inequality in particular, right, could be in some ways bad for meritocracy, because if inequality produces yes, it gets in the way, so that of this, then it could be bad. But yeah, that again, to me, that goes then to this definition, right? So yeah, like this is the measure that we have, right? Defined this way. And of course, then we could go deeper and try to figure out where does intelligence in that sense comes from. But however intelligence is generated, once it's there, we will want to see if that actually then relates to income, your income, right? Yes. Okay, so there's some related literature here. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, right? There is let's say, growing evidence that not just on, let's say, things like do people reward error or not, but to do that at the global level, right? A lot of this evidence, though, it's based on what I would say is beliefs, right? It's not a direct measure. It's about what people think, right? So perceptions of inequality and the role of luck versus effort, for instance, that's been studied very well. Or normative beliefs about how people should be rewarded or not, the extent to which people think of this, right? Um, so compared to those, right, we are having a much more direct type of approach in this particular work, right? The closest paper, I would say, to us conceptually would be Bandera's work on also, she explicitly calls it meritocracy. She has a slightly different focus, right? She's more focused on the match between workers and job requirements. So she was calling, let's say, a meritocratic society one where the people that are good at math are working in math-related jobs, for instance, right? We are taking a different route, is to say, no, we're trying to measure a general measure of performance and see whether that is correlated with income. Cristina.
Ernesto, yes, I have a question just before that. When you talk of fluid intelligence and you need to measure it, basically, to correlate, is it something like the non-verbal tests that are given to people like Wechsler and stuff like that? What do you look at? Because you have to correlate
Yes,
these two things.
that's the next slide.
Okay, all right.
Yes,
All right.
yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Why don't we jump in and straight into what exactly do we do? So this was like it's a part of like this big study that we ran that we are calling the World Behaviors and Stereotypes data set, where we did incentivized online experiments in 23 and 24 across 70 countries. In total, 65,000 subjects with representative samples. Representative meaning here we representatives in terms of education, gender, and age for the given country. And this was data that we collected through Ipsos, so that's a worldwide marketing company. Yes, most countries we sampled for 1,000, where there's a few countries we did with a bit more and a few that we did with a bit less. A lot of that driven by availability of how easy it was to sample within a given country. So there you have the map of the countries that we have data for. Let me see. And this answers Christina's question. This is the incentivized measure that we did. So fluid intelligence, we did a short form of the Reuben's matrices test. Again, non-verbal, very easy to kind of like the instructions are pretty straightforward. And then people would just have to, let's say they get a pattern like that, they need to pick the one that fits a given pattern, right? So the one we did was, like I said, is a short form version because we couldn't run like the 42 question version. So this was a nine questions that are chosen to have a slightly different difficulties. Unlike in the usual way that Reuben is let's say is administered, we did incentivize it for correct answer. And this was in a way, yes, we want to make sure that everyone had an incentive to answer this in a way, and that we're not picking up something more just like your desire to answer abstract questions. Everyone was motivated through monetary incentive, right? So that's our measure of fluid intelligence. We have some self-reported demographic information, including income in bins. And then for the rest of the data, we collect data from the different countries, from the usual sources, World Bank, IMF, and so on, where we use, in this particular case, we're using the GNI per capita as the measure of wealth at the country level, and Gini for inequality. And this was pre-registered in OSF. Okay. Okay, so let me just start giving you again. So we did this through this company, right? And this is just to show you a little bit, opening the hood and showing you a little bit the data. One worry that we had is that we did representative samples, but not based on income. That was not used for the sampling. So we want to make sure that at least we have a good sample of income, that we're covering a whole range. We have both rich, poor, middle class, and so on. And for most countries, that's the case. I mean, you can see that there's some outliers, like South Africa, where, yes, part of this sometimes was the exchange rate issue, but in most countries we do have a range. So we have from the lowest bin to the highest bin, we have people there, so we can investigate that the range. And this is just to show you again, this is how basically the correlation between our measure of income versus what we see measures of income coming from external sources, the World Bank and so on. It's highly correlated, right? So in that sense, we can feel sort of like confident that our income measure is capturing the income in a given society. But yeah, there's some outliers like Egypt and the UAE and Norway where we are a bit further away, right? But overall, we are pretty happy with our income measure. And then here you have the distribution for the fluid intelligence. So here I remember, so people had they answered 9 questions. So the best you could do was score 9. Thankfully for us too, we ran this before ChatGPT and so on. Like all of those things exploded. So we know they're not using LLMs to answer these questions. And in fact, yeah, what we see is we see by and large a nice distribution in most countries, again, from low performing to high performing. Right? So this is what we see. We see also variation between countries on this. So those are our measures. And now comes the meat of the paper, is to say, okay, so, and then what we do is something very simple. We just say, okay, for each country, we just run a regression where we regress income on our fluid intelligence measure or IQ. Income, we're doing it in percentiles, right? So it's not the absolute amount. It's really just how you compare within the country to IQ, right? We are, yeah, that it doesn't actually matter too much for the results because we sample based on this, but yeah, we in the regressions we use the sampling weights to approximate as close as possible the representativeness of a given country, right? So our meritocracy index is just simply this coefficient, the coefficient of IQ as predictive of income. Simple, right? So that's all we do, right? And this is the result. Here we go. So what do we find? First thing is lots of country variation. In most countries, something like 75% of countries, the association between income or between fluid intelligence and income is positive, right? So in some countries, the most meritocratic by our measure is Switzerland. The least is China, although, yeah, China, I'm a little bit, I'm not sure what's going on there. But overall, we see this pattern. So most countries is positive, but there's important variation between countries. So it doesn't look the same everywhere, okay? And that's then what we're going to be using later on. But one view of this is to say, okay, so there is meritocracy in that sense of it does exist, at least in some countries, but and less so in others, right? Let me see. Oh, I lost. I was going to say, yeah, I'm from Costa Rica, so Costa Rica is somewhere here towards the lower end of the distribution. Okay, so then what we're saying is, okay, so we do find evidence that intelligence predicts income. It does so differently in different countries. Now the next question is to say, well, if this is a measure of meritocracy, if you buy that, right, then does meritocracy, how does this relate to what we, where I started, is to say, are countries that are more meritocratic also countries that are more, let's say, have a higher, in our case, GNI per capita, right? Is meritocracy in that sense a good thing? What we find is that in some ways, yes, we find a positive correlation. So more meritocratic countries tend to have higher GNI per capita. And I mean, this is the raw correlation. Here we have the regression format. It's just to say, So here we have 69 countries. Meritocracy index significantly predicts GNI per capita. That's just a simple regression. In this one, which is actually, I prefer it to some extent, here we are controlling for the level of intelligence in the country, right? Because remember, meritocracy is the relationship between intelligence and income. And here we're controlling for the level as well. And what we see is that the level does predict higher GNI per capita, but on top of that, the relationship between meritocracy and individual income predicts, actually, and the coefficient actually gets a bit stronger, predicts higher GNI per capita, right? So this seems to support this idea that having a meritocratic society could be a good thing for at least for wealth in this respect. Okay. Now we go a little bit deeper. Let me see. Yeah, we go a little bit deeper. Try to look a little bit inside the hood of what is driving this. One obvious kind of like thing to look at is education, especially since we're talking about IQ. So here what we do is to say, well, is this something to do with education? There is a well-known correlation between Reuben matrices and education, right? It's controversial to say why that occurs, but then what we do is to say we want to see is whether meritocratic countries where the correlation between Reuben matrices and income is high, maybe countries in which there is a high correlation between Reuben matrices and education. It could be that, let's say, smart people are getting educated and then education is giving them a boost in income. Or it could be that that the variation in this is actually driven by the effects of education. So in some countries, maybe education produces a big boost in income. In others, it could be smaller, right? So we want to kind of like break that down. And to do that, we just use a simple decomposition, right? So we're basically saying Reuben's matrices, would predict education. That would be this regression here with this coefficient. And then that would be the indirect effect. So if smarter people get educated and education gives you a high return, then that would be the indirect effect. And you could also have then a direct effect where controlling for education, your income is higher if you have a higher fluid intelligence or if you have higher performance in that sense. Right? So we can separate these two things. And this is just to show you the direct versus the indirect measure. So as to say, there's some countries where we find evidence of both, right? So that would be this quarter here. So here you have both a positive effect of the indirect effect and the direct effect. But in some countries, let's say you could have a negative direct effect and a positive indirect effect, for instance, right? So this is where we see, for example, the US it's actually there, right? So we see that they have a negative direct effect, but a very strong positive indirect effect. Now, what happens when we look at this decomposition in relationship with GNI per capita? Here, what we find is that the correlation between basically our measure of the meritocracy and GNI is pretty much captured mostly by the indirect effect. So that's basically saying that the countries where the high fluid intelligence people get educated, those are the countries where we see that they also have a higher GNI per capita. And there's very little evidence that just because if you have a positive direct effect, that produces higher GNI per capita, right? So this, informally, I mean, to me, this sounds then to me like there's an institutional effect here, right? Because it goes through the educational channel, okay? Here's the same regression once we actually control for the level of education and the level of the Reuben's matrices scores, right? Which again, I prefer this regression because this is saying, right, it's not that education is giving you a higher, I mean, actually could, but here we're controlling for that. It's not that education is giving you higher overall intelligence in a country, and that's why you are more productive, because that will be captured by these coefficients. It's really that it's the sorting, right? The going of being high in high fluid intelligence and getting educated. The countries that have a high correlation there, controlling for the level, are the ones that have higher GNI per capita, and that would be this coefficient over here. And this is just if you want to really break it down a little bit more and to say, is because we can even say whether is the education effect, is it because of the sorting part, or because education itself has higher returns in some countries than others? So that would be this education direct effect. And what we see is that, I mean, both matter, but the main effect is about the highly fluid intelligent going and getting educated rather than education itself having a big impact on income itself. All right. So this is what we find. As Angela was pointing out, I mean, it's all correlational, right? I mean, when you're doing this type of research, I don't know how else we could do it, but this is what we find. Okay. There, of course, that raises the question of then what are actually this measuring? What is the meritocracy index capturing? So the association between meritocracy index and GNI per capita is driven again by within country correlations between education and Reuben's matrices scores. One interpretation of that, which is I guess a little bit what in the direction of what Angela was saying, is that some countries are better at channeling individuals with high fluid intelligence towards university education. That would be a more of a like the institutional aspect of it. But another one would be the other way around, is to say, well, another interpretation is that if you are, let's say, going to the university, there's some countries where universities are just better quality, or they're somehow just better, and they are the ones that cause you to have higher fluid intelligence, right? We cannot fully like separate that because we have just correlational data, but there is these two channels. What we have done is to say, well, let's try to get some measures of educational quality to see whether whether if we control for those, then whether these correlations are reduced. So this is a bit the idea. What we find there is a little bit mixed, as to say, if we control for things like expenditures in education as a percentage of GDP, we see that it does knock down the coefficient of our meritocracy index, but it doesn't eliminate it, right? It's still there. And the same is true for when we control for, whether it's expenditures in education, whether that's about primary education or tertiary education, all of those things matter, but the coefficient is still there, right? So that seems to suggest that there's not just a story about you have more, you throw more money at education, you have a better educational system, and this is what causes this effect of what we're calling the meritocracy index, right? But again, it's only suggestive. I'll be super interested in how we could dig deeper to try to separate this two. Okay, now that was about meritocracy as we define it and GNI per capita. The other side of it was about what about inequality, right? I would say there's two stories here. One is to say, well, if we look at the lab results that says in a highly meritocratic society, people should be less willing to redistribute income because people deserve, if you're rich in a meritocratic society, you deserve to be rich, right? So there, and at the same time, if you have that type of situation, then you should have a higher inequality, right? So that would be one simple story behind it. The other story is actually closer to more like, I would say, what sociologists have been saying all along, is to say, well, actually, inequality can get in the way of meritocracy, because if you have a highly unequal society, then the rich people control, let's say, the high income jobs, and they just keep that passing on to their kids and so on, or to their friends. And then actually, then it's less meritocratic than a society that would be less equal, maybe, and where you have a more playing field, and where individual merit could be rewarded then more easily, right? What do we find? Let me see. Here we go. We find a very clear negative effect. So what we find is that more meritocratic societies with our measure are also more equal societies. Right? So we find more evidence of the latter, is to say, if what this seems to suggest, that if you want meritocracy, which we showed does produce higher productivity, higher GNI per capita, if you want a meritocratic society, you need less inequality, and that's what actually then would produce that, right? This is even more clear. Sorry, this is just here where if we break it down with education, unlike in the other case, here we do find evidence that both the direct and indirect effect have an effect on predicting this relationship between meritocracy and inequality. But let me see here. I just wanted to show you this. So here, what I'm saying is like, okay, but let's look at inequality, two different types, you could say. Here we have on the left, it's the Gini coefficient before taxes, so before redistribution happens. And then here we have it, let's say we're separating, right? Is to say pre-tax Gini coefficient, and then the degree of redistribution, which is how much this Gini coefficient changes once you factor in all the taxation and all of those things, right? And what we find is that on the pre-tax Gini coefficient, there we don't find much of a relationship with meritocracy. Where we find it is in here. So it's more like saying countries that are more meritocratic by our measure are also countries that redistribute a lot. All right, John, this is.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Well, this is just a general question, and probably better asked at the end. But
Okay. Well, yeah, I'm basically out of time. So just to then wrap up, this was short. Yeah, it was a short talk. Meritocracy, what do we look at? We look at meritocracy and GNI per capita. We find that higher meritocracy is associated with higher GNI per capita, and that this association propagates through the educational channel, highlighting the importance of mapping high performance into educational outcomes. And then when it comes to meritocracy and inequality, what we find is that more meritocratic countries are less unequal. And inequality seems not to be explained by meritocracy, which gives additional support to this idea that actually redistribution policies could have value, not just because you might consider it fair or something like this, but also because I think in some ways they might be leveling the playing field more, so that then something like fluid intelligence could actually then deliver higher meritocracy. And I think that's it. Yeah.
Thank you so much,
45
Ernesto.
minutes.
Well, we have now about 15 minutes of Q&A, and I see already 3 raised hands. So, Ernesto, I let you take the questions.
Well, let's see. I don't know in what order they were raised. So, but well, I saw John first, so maybe.
Yes,
okay.
John,
Well,
it's first.
in the first graph, if I understood it correctly, China showed a negative relationship between intelligence and income. And this struck me as really strange, because China, this is a place where the educational system is extremely competitive and everyone tries to get into college, and they have, after school preparation. You would think that there would be the opposite relation. And what that led me to suspect was that you were actually getting these measures of intelligence and income from the subjects themselves. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Well, if you were doing that, then how do we know that doesn't have to do with the way this? It was Ipsos, the company that sampled the subjects. So it's a question here not of the population, but who shows up to do questionnaires. I don't know why it would be that would create a negative relationship, but do you have a way of investigating that possibility?
We've done a bunch of checks, right, to see how, at least on observables, how representative our subjects are of what we know of given countries. And there it looks pretty good, right? So that there doesn't seem to be, I don't think necessarily it's a sampling issue. Yes, so income here is self-reported. So that we cannot fully exclude that maybe there's some weird effect there. I don't know, right? It's
I was
not
just thinking that people with high income and low education don't show up to do questionnaires, or the other way around. It's a question of who shows up, and they make no effort to make sure that the correlations within their sample are representative of the correlations within the population.
That would be nice to see. The issue is, let's say there are no nationally representative samples of fluid intelligence, because that's not really measured. So we cannot fully check. We have to, like I said, when we look at things like, there are some databases of IQ tests, not necessarily the one we use, but others. We do find that at least at the country level, they're related. But yeah, we cannot fully exclude that there could be something going on. And actually, what some people have told me that, about China in particular, because China seems to be an outlier, but some people were telling us that in China, maybe Reuben matrices is not a good measure because they are trained to take it. So maybe there, Reuben's matrices is actually not measuring intelligence, but measuring how much your parents pushed you to study this particular type of test, right? So
that may be intelligence.
Okay. All right. But that they're training to the test in a very direct way, right? So that's something that that's come up a few times that I cannot. But China does look like an outlier in our sample. Yes, Yes.
So
Christina,
my turn. Sorry.
Yes, I think Moti went first.
Okay, Moti.
Okay.
Hi, Ernesto. How are you?
Hi.
So I have one comment and one question. The comment relates to Angela's first comment about the possibility of reverse causality. I think that maybe you can avoid all this discussion by thinking about equilibria. So you could there are countries with a separating equilibrium where intelligence and income goes hand in hand, and countries where you have a pooling equilibrium where there's no such separation. So this could be a possible solution. If I would have to model it, this is maybe the way I would think about it, like an equilibrium result where income and education and the intelligence go together hand in hand. Now to my question, the way you measure meritocracy is how income is affected by intelligence, but then you tell us that the main channel goes through education. So you get to the point where it is about how income is affected by education, which is basically returns to education. So to me it sounds like as if you redefine meritocracy as returns to education, which could be a fine definition, but wouldn't this be
No,
like
but just
what you
to
actually?
clarify that. So yeah, I was going very quick. So like so what we find is that no, it's not the returns to education. So it's not whether education, whether let's say having a university degree boosts your income a lot, is who gets the university degree. This is what this is, seems to be what we find, because this is where it's the sorting of people into education and not the returns of education itself, the main predictor.
But then you go to income also, so it's not
Yes.
only who goes to education, it's also how the people who go to education are rewarded in their income, no?
Yes, but that's that. Yes, maybe. Yeah, I went very quickly through, but that would
For
be
example,
like this.
controlling for intelligence, you have a positive coefficient, right? Controlling for intelligence or not.
Sorry. Yeah, where do we have here? That would be this one. Yes. So this is the returns to education. This is what we're calling here the education direct effect. That would be if you
I
get a degree,
see.
how much that
I
boosts
see.
your income.
So on
This is what
top
we're
of it,
calling the education meritocracy. It's about who goes and gets the degree.
I see. Okay, thanks for clarifying.
Hmm.
Yeah. Cristina,
Ernesto, I have a really different question. I find it very interesting, the relationship with education. And I would suggest to expand a little bit the analysis of education system. And I tell you why. Because we have many countries, like in Europe, for example, the education system is national. So it's a state that decides how much math, how much physics, how much this or much that we do in a high school, for example. In America, is the opposite. It's very, local. Programs differ a lot, etc., etc. And so it would be very interesting to look, when you look at the education effects, check about different countries and educational differences in different countries. Okay, so countries that have basically a country intuitively that has a very, national education system, in some sense, is more egalitarian in the use of intelligence through education, versus a country which has a lot of, each state in the US can decide, and within each state, schools may differ a lot, etc., etc. These are different conduits, really different channels, and somebody may be super intelligent and don't do very well, I don't know, in Tennessee, versus, other area. And I'm always worried, coming from Europe and coming to the States, about the total mess, in some sense, of the lower level education system. And so I would be very interested if you can look at the really different national versus spread out local programs, and what is the relationship to, this fluid intelligence, and then, passes through that and then goes to income. I'm very curious about that. And I think you can do that easily.
Okay. No, that's interesting. Yes, we haven't because just to make sure I got it, like, you're saying like the degree to which, let's say, education is centralized, or the educational policy, right? Because we have looked at the degree to which there is education is public versus private, and that doesn't do much for us. But
No.
what you're saying is more about the policy, right?
Yes. Because in Europe, even if it's private, you go to a religious school, let's say, the education is the same. Because in the end, they have to take the same topics, you know, and in the same, I would use a stupid word, quantity. And this is not the case in the US, for example. So there is a significant difference here.
Okay, no, that's a good suggestion. We'll look into that.
I am very curious to see how you get, what sort of results you get.
Jonas?
Hi, Ernesto. Thank you so much for the interesting talk. So my question concerns the relation between income and intelligence. So you motivated intelligence, this is fluid measure in order to basically capture a correlation that you see between different sectors. But couldn't it be that just basically the correlation between how much predicted value do we really have from fluid intelligence differs between, let's say, agriculture and some tertiary businesses, so that what you're really capturing is more the distribution of different sectors in a country rather than really meritocracy.
Yeah, so we could try to, I mean, that's a bit tougher to try to kind of control for. Like the claims, like if you look at the fluid intelligence literature, they claim that it's equally good at predicting, let's say, performance in things like farming versus office work, but there is variation, right? So yeah, I wonder if there's some aspect of that going on, right? And that goes a little bit closer to Bandera's work, where she's looking at how not fluid intelligence, but how different skills correlate with your job later down the line, right? Yeah, I wish I had a better answer than that, but I mean the claim of fluid intelligence is that it's a good predictor across the board, right? But yeah, we should take that a little bit with a grain of salt.
Great, thanks.
John, you had
I had another question. Looking at the thing that's on the screen now, I cannot work out what would happen if you used the intelligence as the intervening variable rather than using education. That is, there is a story that education makes you smarter, and maybe, and I would just like to know what the direct and indirect effects are if you did it that way instead of the way you did it. Of course, all of these are subject to the problem of error of measurement, since you could get a significant direct effect just because the indirect effect is full of error, or vice versa, and you could correct for that. But in any case, what if you do it the other way? What happens then? Have you done it?
I mean, there are correlations, right? So yeah, if you switch it around, they will. So this is an interpretation, right? And we're trying to address this point a little bit more directly because, like you said, well, we can flip it around and.
But does it work if you flip it around? Would it work just as well? I can't figure it out.
I mean, that's harder to see here, right? Because we're doing this at the country level, right? So this is the correlation between, let's say, in our case, would be between fluid intelligence and getting educated within a country, right? And then the variation across countries on this measure that we then use to predict the GNI per capita. What we're trying to do to kind of like look at this a little bit is to see, to use, let's say, natural, well, not fully natural, but let's say natural educational reforms or that we know happen in particular countries that boosted the amount of people that got educated for presumably an exogenous reason, not because the country got smarter, but because they changed policy, right? And to see whether that actually then helps us explain within country variation in intelligence, right? So pre-reform versus post-reform, people that were on both sides. and to see whether then we can actually try to see what's the a little get a more of a causal story. But we're still in the process of that because getting all this data on reforms is quite difficult.
Okay, thanks. I thought you were doing a traditional mediation analysis, but now I'm not sure you are. But okay, thanks.
Thank you everyone for your questions. Now it's finally time. I see there are still some questions in the chat, but sadly we will have to begin to wrap up. But please feel free to send if you have remaining questions to Ernesto's email. And then Ernesto, if you could stop sharing your screen, I will share my screen one last time.
Sorry.
Perfect. Well, thank you again, both speakers, for the fantastic presentation. And thank you everyone for the very interesting discussion, very, very engaging today. That's great. Final reminder that we are taking a break this summer from the NoBec talks, and we will restart again in September 17 from a talk from Catherine Molo. And since then, thank you a lot everyone for participating, and see you next time. Have a great summer.